Welcome this afternoon to this month's Practice as Research Network. It's the last one for this academic year, which has been a really great experience. We've had some fantastic talks and presentations, and today is going to be no different. So what we've got today is Matthew Butcher with us. Thank you, Matthew, for being here. And Matthew is going to be talking about the architecture of slowness, reflecting on the actions of historical repetitions and loops. And I have asked Matthew to come along and present because as part of the Practice as Research seminar series, we're trying to highlight the different forms that practice as research may take. And in this particular case, obviously, this is outside of my area of expertise altogether, but I'm still hoping to be able to learn of what it actually means to do practice as research. So with no further ado, I'd like to hand over to Matthew. And yes, please, just present your talk, and then we'll have a conversation around the different kinds of things that come up.
Thank you very much, Nicola, for inviting me to speak. It's very interesting what you're trying to do, and hopefully my talk will tap into some of the themes or relate to some of the themes that you're trying to set up with this network. So I'm going to try and share my screen. Yep, there we go. Can you see that okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, so actually I've got to change this. Oh no, that's not right. Sorry. Okay. So today I'm just going to present a series of my design projects and start to try to link them into certain kind of theoretical ideas I've been kind of working with alongside the design of the architectural projects, and specifically two areas of interest in my work, and to explore the kind of origins of where and why that has been the focus of what I've been trying to do over the last 10 years. So I'm just going to start with reading out a brief description of a kind of overview of what the work's been doing. So the ambition for my work over the last 10 years has been driven by a deep concern that we are becoming increasingly disembodied from and disenchanted by our experience and understanding of the material and physical world. This is being driven by ongoing philosophical legacies of modernity that we are still forced to operate within, politically, socially, and culturally. These legacies have proliferated a desire for dominance over nature, a celebration of technological progress, a technocratic means of operation, a desire to deny history, and to a certain extent context. They are positions that have led directly to the damage that is being currently done to our environment, with the fifth assessment report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, stating that with high confidence, this damage will have irreversible and dramatic consequences on our ways of life. These effects of climate, identified by the IPCC, include worldwide disruption of existing ecosystems, an increase in dramatic weather conditions such as coastal flooding, threat of drought, extreme precipitation, rising sea levels, and extensive coastal erosion. For geographer Lee Glover, in his book Postmodern Climate Change, the link between modernity and climate change is undeniable. He states that to identify climate change as an outcome of modernity is, at the one level, a statement of the obvious. It is a contemporary issue born of an industrial society. Going further in his analysis, his argument focuses on the idea that it is not just about industrialization, but also about the process of governance, emphasis on scientific solutions and technology that are fundamentally contributing to the problem and not allowing for a solution. For Glover, one of the problems of this emphasis on technology that is being driven not by any specific core social, political, or cultural necessity, but rather as part of modernity's fixation on a narrative of progress. Outlining this issue, he states, central to modernity is the doctrine of progress. Modernization is premiered on the belief that through modernity, society improves upon its predecessors, going on to present the idea that Western society has taken the doctrine of progress as a social norm and form of meta-narrative. The concept of progress is embedded in the cultural rubric of modern society. As a means of opposing and finding an alternative to these conditions of modernity, and specifically the rubric of progress associated with it, my work has focused on two key explorations. Firstly, it is focused on the making of an architecture that can reframe our understanding of and our relationship to the environments we inhabit and the effects of climate change. One of the key ambitions then of my work is to question propositions such as what's being presented here, which is a new, more advanced flood barrier that would sit in Tilbury in the Thames estuary and would essentially stop and prevent flooding of London and of the Thames Gateway, so valuable land for development in the in the case of rising sea levels, which we know will happen. My issue with these kind of technological solutions, if you like, to the effects of climate change is that they firstly require vast amounts of resources to design and build, but also then they require vast amounts of energy to run. And secondly, they also give us the impression that we are somehow immune to the effects of nature, and that we can technologically design ourselves out of the crisis through our progress and innovation. So this kind of hubris, if you like, can also be witnessed in what is a very, could be seen as a very positive thing, and is a positive thing, which is the ongoing desire for regulatory bodies and governments involved in the planning and design of the built environment to regulate for the control of buildings and cities and the internal environments around our cities. This obviously has positive health potentials, but it tends to reduce everything to a kind of statistical norm where humans become no longer active in the choice of whether they are hot or cold. The buildings, in a way, dictate the nature of how they sense and feel within the environments that they are inhabiting. Also, you have a big move within particularly European bodies to move to automated control systems and controlled by computers, often by computers that are in different cities to the buildings themselves, which make humans, just inactive entities within these environments. Also, a lot of the building materials and products that are being used to help seal these environments or create more efficient environmental control systems are manufactured out of petrochemical materials, which is also perpetuating an existing problem through notions of extraction and the use of oil as a kind of integral component of our economy and social life, our social being. So as an alternative to these conditions, I started a series of projects that looked at the idea of habiting a proposed floodplain that would exist in the mouth of the River Thames in the estuary, both on the north side and the south side of the river. On the south side of the river, these projects exist in a proposal where I would suggest the removal of the current sea wall on the south bank and allow the river to splay into the historic salt marshes at Cliff, creating an intertidal zone. So within this zone, you would essentially have a situation that would exist like this. This is Abbott Hall Farm in Essex, where they've tested a situation of breaching the seawall and allowing the land to flood. What this has allowed is essentially an area of runoff water that the sea can travel into, which actually protects areas of land further upstream. So it has a kind of positive facet to its infrastructure. So within my own design, looking at the positioning of the river within this context, and then the design of both large and small scale architectures that would inhabit this environment, such as buildings or shelters made of reeds and also sediment, that can be inhabited. Also, the construction of sediment-based infrastructures that would be formed through the installation of sediment nets that would slow the river's water and allow beaches to form, that would allow you to travel across this landscape. And then kind of more absurdist or speculative ideas, such as houses that might be blown across the water when it freezes on the ice, particularly an idea that would be possible if temperatures become more extreme, and also if the shallow nature of a lot of the marshland that would occur in that region. So again, all of these designs would be possible and would also become habitable or would become activated through shifts in the climate, making you more aware of these processes. I actually in 2006 got to construct one of these ideas, which was the Flood House, which was a project I developed with curator Jez Fernie and Focal Point Gallery in Southend for a floating house. It was a speculative idea for a house, but also a weather station. This structure was moved around the coast of Essex during the summer of 2016, highlighting the very particular nature of the landscape around the estuary and the Essex coast. And in particular, it followed the path of the sea walls that exist there, showing how they've essentially divided up the land. So that's a photo of it at Southend Pier. So the second critical facet to my work, alongside this desire to kind of highlight the effects of climate change or change to the environment, is to also challenge the existing rubric, if you like, of the philosophical notion of progress that's inherent within modernity and the modernity that exists in our current society. And specifically, rather than or this is part of it, design architectures that exist in landscapes that are a threat of climate change, is also to look at the way that the architectures are designed and to challenge the notion of progress within these methodologies. And specifically within this, I'm trying to critique an increased body of practitioners and theoreticians within the discipline that are trying to emphasize the use of technology in the design and construction of buildings. This exists within theories around parametricism, which was championed a lot by Zahadid architects, and utilizes the idea that you can program in the parameters of any building that include cost, materials, climate, inhabitation, function, and essentially the computer will give you the most optimized form for that particular use. And part of the narrative of this is increasingly that this is the more efficient way of designing architecture, and that without this efficiency, that architecture will remain archaic and outside of the kind of neoliberal market economics that we exist within. So this is very much about trying to valorize architecture within the market. The other I suppose type of discourse around computation and computers that I'm trying to critique is the increased relationship or relationship to digital manufacturing, the desire to create a more direct relationship between the design of buildings and their construction, and the idea that you would use robots or drones to construct buildings. Again, buildings that tend to be based upon algorithmic or artificial intelligence or parametric design methods. So against these architectures, I'm trying to propose an architecture of slowness. And the origin of this idea of slowness has in part emerged from the reading of philosopher Bruno Latour's essay, which is titled Attempt at a Compositionist Manifesto. And in the essay, Latour seeks to criticize the actions of the moderns and their fixation on the pursuit of the new. He points at how the climate crisis we are now experiencing was driven by a desperate desire for individuals to progress, and specifically for Latour to escape history. For Latour, it was modernity's intrinsic emphasis on progress, and with it the need to move quickly away from current and past conditions, whether social, political, or cultural, that increased industrialization and the desire for technological advancement. As a way of providing an alternative to this condition, Latour calls to us to acknowledge that the time of time has passed, and instead he asks us to look around, feel, and see the world in order to be more aware as we move forward. As part of this inquiry within this presentation, I would like to present how my architectures exist as slowness and act as forms of critique against society's ongoing reliance on fossil fuels and our increased levels of consumption on them. So just to paraphrase that, in the next body of work, I am seeking to present the way that the design methodologies that I used within certain of my design projects could be seen within themselves as a critique of modern society on modern society's reliance on notions of progress. So the next project I'd like to present is the Silt House. The Silt House belongs to the same family, if you like, as the other ones I presented, in the sense that it was an architecture that was designed for a landscape that would be affected by seasonal flooding or prone to seasonal flooding. Like the other projects, it's situated on the mudflats, but it's concrete, and it's a sealed structure that would be a house for 1 or 2 families, principally. As part of its operation in its location, the structure is also designed to enable the collection and disposition of sediment onto its structure that increases the thermal mass of the building and increases the insulation properties of the structure during the winter months. So the sediment forms like a second skin when it is deposited onto the structure. Just some drawings of a model showing what this would look like. So one of my key influences for this particular piece of work was the work of avant-garde architect and poet Raymond Abraham, and particularly his 10 Houses projects, which were designed and drawn. They exist primarily as drawings, models, and bits of buildings, but apparently drawn, and they were designed and created between 1970 and 1973. And what was kind of really important for me within this work, or has been very important for me in this work over the last 10 years or so, is the way that Abraham has tried to find an architecture which allows the natural environment to change its form, or is the natural environment becomes kind of synthesized within the framework or the form of the architecture. What's also really critical for his work, and actually, as you'll see later on in the presentation, others of this period, was their critique within the design of this architecture of what they saw as the manipulation and control of architecture at that time, with practices that were focused also on an emphasis on technology and technocracy, and particularly ideas of form follows function, where the function took precedent over any aesthetic or philosophical debate. And in many instances, the function was a calculable square footage or a kind of socially engineered idea of how we should live. So in the image is one of Abraham's 10 Houses project, which was the house with curtains, which is this kind of gridded form, and where the facades of the building are made of these blown curtains that would be shifted and moved as the wind passed. You have the earth cloud house, where the roof and main structure of the building is a mirrored surface that constantly reflects the sky and the moving clouds, but then also its basement it takes the form of a cloud in itself. and then House of Two Halves, which is essentially a kind of buried structure in a burial mound, which is kind of reference back to a kind of primeval or prehistorical type architecture. So parallel to my interest in Abraham and also asking questions of how it might influence my own work, I was also drawn to the work of Peter Eisenman, who was situated in New York at the same time as Raymond Abraham, and was also a colleague of his teaching at the Cooper Union. And both of them were drawn to this idea of a critique against this ongoing emphasis on technology and technocracy dominating architectural discourse at the expense of a philosophical exploration. Unlike Abraham, Eisenman's particular resistance, if you like, to the dominant forms of architecture as he saw was not necessarily to look at the relationship between architecture and nature, but to explore a historical precedents, particularly architecture from the 1930s, that he believed were driven ultimately by an aesthetic and philosophical ambition. So one of the people that he was most influenced by was Giuseppe Tarangi, who this is a building of his in Lake Como, who Eisenman argues was fundamentally driven by decisions around composition, around experience, around the play of light and form, and driven by a kind of philosophical discourses that were happening in the early part of the 20th century that Eisenman felt had been lost. So as part of his desire to adopt these architectures and bring them into a contemporary context, Eisenman conducted a PhD in Cambridge University in 1963, where he moved to England. He then travelled back from England to the US after completing the PhD. But during this time, he conducted these kind of forensic analysis of the buildings that he thought were, manifested his desire for what architecture should be. So within these drawings, their analysis is of composition, of the facades, of the different geometries, highlighting the different geometries in different ways, and basically removing the physicality of the building into a set of codes or grammar, if you like, that then he would then use to develop his buildings over the next 10 to 20 years. So these are the drawings of Tarangi's building in Como. So kind of influenced by this notion, I was fascinated by the idea of in what way could I, in the development of the Silt House and my relationship with Abraham, in what way could I start to develop my own grammar from Abraham that then would apply to the design of the Silt House. And the way that I did this is quite simply follow a similar methodology to Eisenman, which is kind of construct quite a forensic analysis of his drawings, kind of dissecting them into specific formal tropes that in a way were abstracting the original architecture, but actually were a process for me to try to understand the components. And through the act of drawing and the analysis that I was conducting in terms of what to draw, why to draw, how to separate it from the drawing, I was in a way forming a mental understanding of what these components are and how, in that process of thinking about the Silt House, just to say these were done, during the actions of the first set of drawings for the Silt House project, they were allowing me to think about what I was drawing and why I was drawing it, and how it might relate to Abraham. So in these four drawings here, we see analysis of the Earth Cloud House and the House of Curtains, specifically the formal nature of the Cloud House, the nature of captivating wind in the curtains, and the idea of a kind of burial or structure that's semi-buried in that process. So kind of looking at how these then manifest themselves in my own design work, or how this process then took ideas from Abraham into my own project. So you can see the reference to the kind of formal relationship with the cloud in the Earth Cloud House kind of manifests itself into the kind of floor plates of the Silt House, which were reminiscent of the mudflats of which the building sat on. Also, the idea of transversing these undulating floor plates would be, the idea is it would be akin to kind of walking on the resistance that you would face when walking on the mudflat of the estuary. The kind of the notion of the burial mound was manifest in the idea of the building being covered in sediment. And then the moving curtains of the house with curtains became the way that the structure's position in the estuary and the way it would control sediment. Just to say that the plan on the right is a simulation I did where I put a model of the building into a simulated kind of estuarial environments with particulates and seeing what would happen to those particulates disturbed by the structure of the house, and how this could be a kind of a barometer, if you like, of flooding. The increased amount of sediment, the increased amount of movement would potentially be indicative of a flood in the case that the waters are moving faster and there is more sediment in the water. In the same way the curtains capture wind, the harder they billow, the more they billow, the more that is an indication of the movements of the wind. So in slight opposition to the kind of quite forensic analysis that I made in the Silt House in terms of reciprocity between a past and a present and a kind of slowness that exists within this reciprocity, my work has also taken on board certain practices associated with performance art, and particularly notions of reenactment. Just to read a couple of notions of what reenactment means. One of the key theorists on this practice is called Rebecca Schneider, and in her book Performance Remains, she states that the practice of replaying or redoing a present event, artwork, or an act, as well as being a mechanism that troubles linear temporality by offering at least the suggestion of reoccurrence or return, even this practice is peppered with an ongoing incompletion. And for performance theorist Andre Lebecki, as set out in his article, The Body as Archive, Will to Reenact and the Afterlives of Dances, the process of reenactment stimulates a capacity to identify in a past work non-exhaustive creative fields of impossible possibilities. And then probably really most critical to the presentation of my work in this talk is the idea, again by Schneider, that the process of a temporal return manifest as reenactment should manifest a political purpose for a critical approach to futurity, unhinged from capitalist development narratives of time and secular investments in progress as strictly linear. So one of the key artists for me, alongside Abraham and Eisenman, and actually working in a contemporary context rather back in the 1960s, is the artist Pablo Bronstein. And what interests me in Pablo or Bronstein's work for particular is this idea that reenactment can exist in a drawing or through a process of drawing. It's not only a kind of performance, if you like, or of a body moving through space. And what's critical within this work is Pablo's notion that through the process of drawing you can role play or reenact historical styles or styles of architects or even people in power that then allow him to create kind of fantastical visions that are weird juxtapositions when you look at them within the contemporary context, because they're of what seemingly historical structures or styles, but they are there to kind of, I suppose, question our relationship to the places that we all inhabit all of the time, which are, in a way, our cities are all constructed, or a lot of them are constructed out of the times that we are living in at the moment. So this is a drawing of Pablo's for an 18th century palace, I think, based on the mole. He did this drawing is where he was role-playing the 1980s architect Michael Graves and then placing it into a 18th century context. And here are the designs for a lighthouse in the style of, but I've forgotten. Well, 18th century style. So the way that I've taken forward Pablo's ideas, it's not strictly to look at 18th century or postmodern architecture recontextualized, but to think of that process as a way for me to draw out a particular idea that was intrinsic in projects like the Silt House that may not necessarily be seen as explicit or be able to be read as explicit without me writing about it. So the process of reenactment becomes a kind of parallel discourse on the work and a reevaluation of the work that has happened after the main design that allows me to draw out ideas that were part of that process, but not necessarily easily read in the final drawings and models of the project. So within Silt House, this existed as redrawing the project as though it were part of an historical work by the architect Bernard Schumi called the Manhattan Transcripts, which was conducted during the early 70s and was primarily exhibited and then produced a book at the for the Architectural Association at the time. And one of the core ideas of the Manhattan Transcripts is the idea that through event, and Schumi allows us to engage with this through the construction of fictional events that he foresaw or imagined for New York. And then he drew these events as kind of choreographed incidences with bodies moving through space. He then also drew these choreographed instances and these bodies moving through space as kind of architectural elements such as walls. And he quotes a performance by Lucinda Charles, who was a key choreographer and dancer in the 1960s and 70s in New York, and her performance in a production of Einstein on the Beach by Philip Glass, and Robert Wilson, where she runs backwards and forwards for 10 minutes. And in running backwards and forwards for 10 minutes, he saw in this performance that she was not only a body moving through space, but she also a piece of architecture. And that this has led him to the Manhattan Transcripts. So in sorry, something's happened. Oh, there we go. So in my drawings of Silt House, one of the key ideas I wanted to draw out was this idea that actually the bodies moving through the building and the movement of sediment in the landscape were a kind of choreographed performance, that the building was forcing both particulates and people to engage with. So by drawing it as part of the Manhattan Transcripts, you start to see people moving across these undulated surfaces of the building, and then also in these segments, the idea of the sediment slowly building up as a kind of solid entity or an architectural entity in and of themselves. Okay, just to finish off, I'm going to talk about another project of mine, which is looking at the architectural practice, the radical architectural practice, Superstudio, who were working in Florence in the 1960s and 1970s. And they were a speculative architectural practice, very similar to Abraham, if you like, but their ambitions were much wider, if you like, in the sense that they were proposing a massive, one of the famous projects they were doing, which is the continuous monument. They were proposing an enormous infrastructure that would encircle the globe. And that everything was emerged from this kind of gridded structure, whether it's furniture or other forms of structures. And they were really like, I mean, similar to Abraham and Eisenman, they were seeking to critique or sartorialize the ongoing obsession within modernity of technology and technocracy, by taking it to the furthest extreme possible. So there's obviously a kind of resonance within what they were doing in their work and what I'm the interest that I have in a contemporary context. So I'm interested in referring back to this period to try to draw something from that into this contemporary context. So the way that I did this in slight opposition to the other forms of synthesis with history that I presented was to actually start to adapt or inhabit and use one of their drawings, which is a drawing of the Missouri furniture series that they conducted in the late 60s, which was a proposal for a body of work, body of furniture really, that was representative of their larger ambitions within the continuous monument. So the action I did is I took the drawing and I dragged it across the surface of a photocopier and distorted it. So it became kind of, undulated forms, and the grid gets completely distorted. So these are two versions of this drawing, and then this is probably the one that was the most successful, where I slid the drawing back in a kind of wave motion across the surface of the scanner. From this, I then started to cut out or isolate certain elements that I could potentially see functioning as architectural components. And the other thing that this process enabled is me to think about the action as a kind of sampling, that you might get within music, where you take a moment in a song or a moment in a beat, which retains the essence of the original, and in many ways the kind of intent or interest or aesthetic importance, but it becomes reconfigured into a different context, but retaining the initial beauty, if you like, within that moment of music. And the same feeling for me was in this process of taking out these, stretching or changing the original drawing and then taking moments out. So from that process, I started to put it into certain architectural viewpoints in terms of an axonometric or isometric, to start to see it potentially as an architectural surface. And then from there, I was interested in that becoming almost directly or literally a structure. And the architecture I proposed was for this platform to exist as a monument to Superstudio, and that would exist beneath the city of Florence. Another process I undertook with this drawing and its distortion was to photocopy it 56 times. And to, in the process of photocopying, to slowly erase the drawing or to remove its complexity, to take it back to an essence. There is a resonance, I think, also within Eisenman's ambitions to pull Tarangi back to a kind of essence, that he was doing within his drawn plans, but I was doing it in kind of a mechanical way, if you like, or a photographic way. So particularly with the later ones, I think that the drawing on my right, I don't know if that's on your left, the most faded one, I then took a portion of that and started to project up lines or points to kind of start to inform some sort of architectural intervention. And what that did, those points, was actually inform the roof structure of the monument to Superstudio. A slightly different design, a later design that I've shown earlier, with this as a round vessel that it contains in. Anyway, these points became these dots that you can see, which were proposed as holes in the flagstones and concrete of Florence above, the city above, that would allow water to collect and drip through. And as it dripped through, it would draw the salts and the different calciums within the concrete and the stone to form what's called calthamites, which are kind of essentially fast-growing concrete-based stalagmites. And when you're in the monument studio, you would look up and see in this weird dotted grid, or not grid, the remnants of the distorted drawing, you see these points referencing that. And then also you would have a series of, drawn on the bottom part of this drawing, you would have a series of air vents that would poke through the bottom of the structure of the surface that would blow kind of gentle air. So as you walked over the surface of the monument to Superstudio, you would get this sense landscape where you would inhabit these points that were then taken from the distorted drawing. And that's probably clearer in there So these are the air vents, and those are the points to collect the calamites. So just in conclusion, building on Bruno Latour's call for us to stop fixating on notions of progress and to end the time of time, I suggest that Silt House and Monument to Superstudio present us with models of architectures of slowness. Within this presentation, I have shown this with reference to the methodologies of design I employed in these projects that have sought to mime and reenact historic architectural works into the later works. Within this specific slowness and the use of history, both Silt House and Monument to Superstudio act as a provocation and resistance to certain architectural practices and discourses that seek to promote a continuing emphasis on the use of computation and the utilization of forms of digital manufacture in the design and construction of architecture. These processes seek to continually enhance efficiency in the service of capital and the expense of our natural environment. Instead, Silt House and Monument to Superstudio ask us to reflect and to move slowly, questioning the didactic separation between what is considered past and present and the idea that time must always follow a linear path forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. This was great. This is really, you know, the thing is, it's really, really exciting to hear somebody talk about, you know, things that we've obviously not been part of because it's not our discipline, but actually there are so many connecting points with, you know, philosophically and methodologically and theoretically, that it kind of is weird to think that, you know, we are coming from different disciplines, because actually there's a lot that we do that you've described. There is a comment in the chat box where which I'm reading out. It says that is fascinating, and the philosophy is very, very, very relevant to me. Thanks so much. So it's exactly that kind of thing, that the connecting points. If you don't mind, I'd like to ask you a couple of questions.
Of course,
so when you're talking about the Silt House project and the Superstudio project, they are obviously methodologically you're approaching them slightly differently. This reenactment process of redrawing and using the photocopier to redraw and reenact in that way. How do you account for what you bring to it? I mean, this is so for this academic year, when we were talking about practice as research within our network, we were like kind of trying to find out how we do reflexivity and what kind of positionality we are taking. So I'm interested in how do you account for the different approaches in these two contexts? You know, why is it that one you're very closely remaining really close to the original by redrawing it, whereas the second one is almost creating your own piece of art? So how do you account for that difference? And I know that the answer is not going to be easy, but it's that kind of thing that we're trying to sort of pull out, extrapolate this academic year.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting question. It's probably, I wasn't able, when I started to write this presentation a couple of days ago, I was do I bring that shift, the reason for that shifting to the fore? And there wasn't really the time, and I felt that it was slightly distracting to the argument. But I mean, it's a very important question. I think the Silt House was created, I mean, it was, you know, nearly 6 years ago, and Monument to Studio was 2 years ago, 3 years ago. So there's quite a big time difference between the two. And within that time frame, I actually edited an issue of architectural design called Reimagining the Avant-Garde, which was looking at the process of how you adapt historical precedents into a contemporary context, and actually trying to get to understand a trend that I was seeing, you know, in 2016, 2017, and certainly when I, you know, after I'd worked on the Silt House. And actually what was quite interesting is I was engaging in quite a lot of conversations about the idea of how do you repeat without repeating,
yes.
You know, and particular concerns from a theorist and journalist called Mimi Zeiger, a writer, who was just very genuinely concerned that if we continually repeat forms or shapes or ideas without intervening in a more direct way, that they become, you know, they become meaningless in a way, how much we protest in that. And I mean, she's very kind about my own work in the sense that she has talked about it, and she feels that there is a criticality in my process. But I still wanted to do a piece that was responding to that in a way, and Monument to Studio was a kind of was an attempt to do that. The idea of how you intervene into a history, how you still create a reflective process on history, without necessarily having to repeat tropes, if you know what I mean. And that was really where that kind of work emerged from. And I have written a bit about that direct relationship. And also I was quite interested in, I mean, again, I didn't talk about this, but I was quite interested in the kind of iconoclasm of Monument to Superstudio, that in the same way that you are engaging with that work, you're also destroying it. And what that means to destroy something you love. And, there's something quite personal about that, but see that also as a creative process, and actually seeing the positivity of trying, the didactic nature of redoing something, but also destroying it at the same time. And that was quite important.
I think it's quite interesting, really, that if you listen very carefully to what you're saying, there are, a number of tensions here. Like you say, in the creation you're destroying, but actually the destruction is not something negative. But at the same time, you're saying that on the one hand, we're looking at, well, there is this critique here about progress. And yet, on the other hand, we're saying we can't keep repeating the same thing. So there is this, again, this tension between, well, progress is problematic, but we do need it to some extent. So it's that kind of element there that's really interesting in your work.
Yeah, I mean, that was sorry, there's a helicopter in the background, so you can hear it, or plane. Yeah, I mean, I am interested in contradictions in work. In a way, they're about asking questions as much as providing solutions. So I wasn't. Yeah, I mean, also you have time to reflect when you're doing something. Sometimes you act on something, initially, or respond to a particular comment or a particular concern, and then the meaning of the work changes as you think about it more, or you talk about it more. And certainly with Monument to Studio, I think my thoughts about it have changed. Its meaning. It's interesting progress with that work. First of all, it's a monument to something, so it's ultimately it's resisting, it's trying to state that we have to memorialize the past while also destroying it at the same time. So it's a weird one, that one. I quite like it. It's kind of stuck in itself, which is the problem of returning to of creating historical loops, I suppose.
When you're saying that you quite like contradictions, is that that practice as research, is that a contradiction to you as well? That the in terms of like the doing and the drawing, for example, to actually be a research process and a reflective process, or is that something that's natural for you?
I've always sought a relationship with history whenever I've been designing. So before I was an academic, before I was involved in teaching, I was always trying to evaluate my work, even as a student, within certain precedents, as a way of validation and criticality. And that's what I see at the essence of a kind of design research process. It provides a space to evaluate and to question what you're doing within relationship to existing context, and through that process to allow the work to gather more meaning. The kind of concretization of that is harder, because written language, I would argue, it's harder to allow there to be ambiguity and contradiction in the same way that you can in a visual medium. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm not as skilled writer as some, but I find it very difficult for there not to be the construction of an argument, and a logical argument in a way gives less room, although it is a very important part of the process, it gets less room than something like a drawing, which can provoke feelings or anxieties or intrigue, things that are less tangible, and don't require necessarily the logics of language. I mean, they have their own logics that they need to respond to. They need to work in a way that's very difficult to quantify what that means, and it tends to be, you know, around a drawing needs to respond to certain criteria, or an architectural drawing, you know, that allows it to be legitimized. I mean, maybe that's the next thing to write about.
Thank you. I mean, to be honest, in many ways, what you're saying just now is actually aligning with what Monica Zazzatelli said in her talk in the seminar from 2 months ago, from May. She is using drawing as part of her sociological research. So she uses drawing to understand how drawing of fashion pieces and clothes in order to understand people's identity work. And she's saying exactly the same thing, that actually, yeah, the engagement with those processes through the collage making and the drawing, it allows for several layers to happen, whereas if you're writing about it, there's only one layer, and that's that layering that's then missing, is the part that makes it so difficult to express what we are actually doing when we're doing practice as research. Well, thank you very much, Matthew. I really appreciate you having been here. It's been great to have you.
Thank you very much.
It's really exciting to hear your work. I'm going to share my screen very quickly just to highlight the Practice as Research Network YouTube channel, and the Buzzsprout channel, and the podcast, and the website, and also obviously there is an opportunity to sign up to the newsletters and to contact me via my work email there on the slide as well. We are taking a break for the summer holidays, but we'll be back in the autumn with a new academic year, and in that new academic year we're going to be focusing on practice as research and anything that has to do with ethical considerations in all of the disciplinary contexts of practice as research. So again, Matthew, thank you very much for having been here, and we hope to see you and everyone again when it comes to the autumn term.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Nicole.